Good morning, and welcome to part 3 of Aristotle's Ethics. So, we've started out, we looked at the concept of the polis in general, and all the related terms that connect to it. So you see this unity of life, that in the polis, human life is really built around one's identity as it's connected to the polis, and everything seems to stem from that. Then we looked at Aristotle's concept of nature. His concept of nature, it is the essence of a thing. It's its eternal and fixed identity. But certain things move, which is to say they change in the course of their existence, and certain things grow. Human beings grow, and they grow in a certain way. Therefore, the nature of a human being is the result, or it consists of, a certain type of growth. And this is the key thing. Aristotle says, toward a certain goal. It's not just to grow and die, it's to develop towards some specific telos or goal that distinguishes the nature of that thing from something else. In the Politcs, Aristotle is concerned with our communal identity rather than us as individuals from the perspective of our own life. And one way to think about the Politcs in contradistinction to the ethics is the Politcs deals with our public and communal or political life, and the ethics deals with the point of view of an individual. It's kind of like the Politcs is the Google Earth view, looking down on the polis at large, seeing us not as distinct individuals, but as parts of a larger organism called a polis. In the ethics, however, we're going to get the perspective of the individual. I don't know, even like those video game perspectives where you see the field of vision and the action from the point of view of a player within the game rather than from a distance. That's the ethics. Okay. Therefore, this development of nature, what did Aristotle say? He said, if one were to see how things develop naturally, from the beginning, one would, in the case of other things, get the best view of them. What are we trying to get the best view of? We're trying to get the best view of the polis as it develops naturally, and therefore its natural development consists of the development of these three communities. So let us turn to our PowerPoint here. Oh, little boo-boo here. Part 3. What is the fundamental distinction between the polis and the other form of communities? It's clearly not for Aristotle simply a matter of size or even organization, although those things are certainly different in key ways. In particular, it has to do with our reason. The human being is the rational animal, and because we are the rational animal, we are also the political animal. So we have to employ our reason in a certain way in order to do what's done in the polis. Now, this is not to say that reason isn't used in these prior communities. The couple, the family, the village, the polis, in the village. Rather, it seems that reason is used in a fundamentally different way. It's used in a distinct way toward a slightly different goal, right? And the question is, how is it used that really distinguishes the polis? Aristotle has told us that, that the polis is a complete community constituted out of several village, and that it is self-sufficient. Self-sufficient. It comes into being for the sake of living, but it remains in existence, not just for living, but for the sake of living well. It comes into existence to meet the needs of survival, but it remains in existence for the sake of living well. It is the complete community, the self-sufficient community, the authoritative community. And I think it's authoritative, meaning it demands the most respect and allegiance because it is self-sufficient and complete. What does it mean to say it's complete or complete? Complete meaning it has everything within it that is necessary for the fulfillment of human nature. Self-sufficient is almost the same thing. Therefore, because it is complete, one does not have to go outside the polis seeking for another way of life to find all the necessities that would facilitate the flourishing or the completion of an individual human life or the life of the community, right? Therefore, this is the community that is the natural end and completion of the prior communities, which is to say this: human life has a telos. He's going to say it's in the ethics, it's happiness. He says it later on in the Politcs. But political community, or rather community as such, has a telos, and that is the polis. The polis. Now the question is, what are some of the things that distinguish the polis apart from scale? Well, let's step back for a moment and look at the question of what Aristotle means by calling these communities natural. He says the couple, the household, the village, the polis are all by nature. What does he mean by nature? He means this, that these communal groups are not accidents of time and space, nor are they cultural constructs. Let's take the family. He does not see the family unit in its division of labor and its goals as a cultural construct, as a product of a certain history or way of thinking that could be another way. He says it's natural, and for him to say it's natural is to say it's necessary. So it's interesting, if I ask students typically, is the family natural, right? A lot of people would say, no, this is a cultural construct. We're forced to shack up this way and have children and care for them in this manner. And Aristotle, we could agree or we could disagree with him, but the key from his point of view is that he claims that it is natural. And what we want to look at is exactly why he claims it's natural. The polis, too, he will claim is natural. The first thing that distinguishes the three prior communities from the polis are the needs or the causes, the needs that are met and the causes that bring them about. And those causes are our needs, right? Let's reiterate. He says in chapter 2, the polis comes into being for the sake of living, but remains in existence for the sake of living well, right? The first thing we see about human sociality, our desire to come together and form bonds with one another, is that we come together out of need. This is certainly not the only reason that we bind together with other people. And in fact, it may not even be the most powerful. When we look at the concept of friendship in books 8 and 9 of the Ethics, it's clear for Aristotle that friendship is not merely a type of survival dependency. But on the most rudimentary level, we need the help of others. To say we have needs is to say we have our bodies, our natures, put upon us necessary demands that we can't get out of, we can't escape. We lack self-sufficiency. What does this mean? This is an important concept. Our bodies produce needs that we cannot fulfill completely and fully under the powers that our body gives us to provide for those needs. Let me say it again. Our bodies produce and our souls produce needs that we cannot fulfill simply under our own powers or under the powers that nature has given us. Which is to say what? We need the help of other people. Right? So Aristotle identifies early on in the couple the most fundamental, foundational cornerstone of human sociality, and that rests on need, or you might today call it self-interest. And here we're talking about the most primitive, primal, basic needs of things like survival, right? We cannot satisfy our needs and interests without the help of others. Therefore, we bind together in communities in order to collectively, in partnership and alliance, to satisfy those ends. Right? And that, of course, is going to form a bond of intimacy in and of itself. However, I think we would all say that we desire other people not just because we're dependent on them in these core needs, but because simply we want to be connected with other people. Okay. The polis, however, comes into existence for the mere needs of life but it remains in existence, as he says, for the needs of the good life. We don't desire merely to survive, but to survive well, or to live well. The good life, living well, happiness, these are all terms for the same thing. The ultimate telos, or goal of our lives, to flourish and be content. Aristotle is going to have a very specific concept of happiness when we look to the ethics. But you notice in these two natural causes which motivate our lives that they are identical in broad part to Hobbes, who says our natural necessary ends are conservation and delectation. Conservation and delectation. He means survival and surviving comfortably, living well, right? And he seems to be talking about bodily pleasure, but Aristotle is certainly not going to confine himself when he talks about the good life to simply bodily pleasure. So we don't merely wish to survive, we wish to flourish, the good life, right? It's the polis that's going to be the place where human beings are able to fully flourish. And what does Aristotle mean by this? He means something very specific. We have raw potentialities as human beings of body and mind, and it's only in the polis that is the thing that's going to provide all the infrastructure, the context, the circumstances, the institutions, the opportunities to fully develop all those faculties. So you look at 2b here. He says we need leisure, right? Leisure. Leisure means free time from labor. If you think of the first three communities, they're all dedicated toward laboring, toward providing for the needs of the body. With the wealth and the complex division of labor, the organization, the infrastructure of the polis, you're going to have sufficient resources for at least a certain group of people to have leisure. The Greek word for leisure is actually skola, it's school, right? We don't mean free time to sip a cold mixed drink. What we're talking about is time liberated from the circumstances of work that provides for the needs of the body, to engage the needs of the soul, to engage the needs of the mind. This is exactly, unfortunately, why Aristotle sees slavery as so central to the civilization of the polis, in that the work of the slave actually provides for the liberty of the head of the household. The freedom of the patriarch of the household is paid for on the back of the slave's labor. The household. What is the household? It's the domain of economics. The Greek word for house is oikos. That's where we get our word economics. Economics has to do with household management, the running of the household, which is the thing that provides the needs for the body. If you think about what economy really it is, it's a system of exchange and production, all built around starting off with providing for the needs of mere life. Right, and then extending up to the needs of the good life. And often we tend to conceive all the needs of the good life purely in economic terms, and Aristotle certainly did it. For Aristotle, the real good life, wealth is a necessary foundation for happiness, but it is not synonymous with happiness. You need money because it is the thing that's going to allow you to provide for the needs of the body, but ultimately for him there are two arenas in which the good life is really going to be found. The public life of the polis, which is made possible by the operations within the house that liberate the head of the household to go out and be a citizen. The citizen being one who participates in the polis, in its public life. Right? And then the second is going to be, interestingly enough, philosophy. As the rational animal, it is, for Aristotle, things like philosophy and science and you could say intellectual or academic study that is the kind of crowning achievement of human nature and its capstone, right? Its capstone. So here you see the four communities, the type in order, the origin. What is the thing, if it's natural and necessary, what is the thing that brings it existence? And what is its goal? Now what's interesting in the case of the first three is that what brings it into existence and its telos, its purpose or goal, is virtually identical. In the polis, however, he makes it very clear how it comes into existence for the sake of living, the needs of mere life, but remains for the sake of living well. So its origin is mere life, and its telos is the good life. In all the other ones, it's a matter of survival, right? And meeting the necessary needs of everyday life. Then the last column here, what is the role of reason, right? And the role of reason will develop up to the polis, in which the use of reason in the polis is going to be qualitatively different than the previous ones. So what I'd like to do now is to turn to the text. Book 1, Chapter 1. Aristotle says this: we see that every city-state is a community of some sort. What's a community? A group of people, not simply in a geographical region, but a group bound by something profound enough to keep them glued together, something they hold in common, the needs of survival. Imagine 5 people on a desert island all by themselves. They might have hated each other in New York City, but when they're shipwrecked up on the shore, all of a sudden they're willing to work together because they'd all like to stay alive, right? We see that every city-state is a community of some sort, and the question is, what sort is it? And that every community is established for the sake of some good. When he says some good, he's referring to some end or some goal, at least that we think or believe to be good. Survival sounds pretty good. What is the good of the city-state? Well, it's established for mere life, but it remains in existence for the good of living well. He says, for everyone performs every action for the sake of what he takes to be good. Notice he takes to be good. Raises the whole specter of the distinction between appearance and reality, what we think or our opinion of what may seem to be good, but may turn out not to be good. And in some cases, we could have perhaps used rational foresight to discern that something was less than good for us, or maybe we only learned through trial and error. Clearly then, while every community aims at some good, the community that has the most authority of all and encompasses all the others and aims highest, that is to say, at the good that has the most authority of all, well, that's going to be the polis. What is the good that has the most authority of all? Well, it's the good, number one, of the entire community, but it's also the good of the individual in its full meaning beyond just the needs of mere life, and that good is only to be found in the polis. He says this community is the one called a city-state, the community that is political. It is complete and has the most authority, and we might say it has the most authority precisely because it is complete. It's superior. So now let's turn to Chapter 2 of Book 1 and look at what he has to say about these various communities as they develop naturally. If one were to see how these things develop naturally from beginning, one would, in this case as in others, get the best view of them. First, then, those who cannot exist without each other necessarily form a couple, as female and male do, for the sake of procreation. They do not do so from deliberate choice, but like other animals and plants, because the urge to leave behind something of the same kind as themselves is natural. Okay, a couple things here. Why do the male and female come together? What is the telos? The telos is procreation, and that's obviously connected with the needs of survival on the one hand, and the only way that human beings thus far can permanently survive, which is to leave something behind of themselves through reproduction. The old generation dies out and the new lives beyond it and carries their identity forward into the future. And you'll notice the motivation here is interesting. There's obviously the survival instinct at work, but he also talks about the pleasure of leaving behind something of their own kind, right? He's talking about here self-love, right? And we see here everything is very self-interested at this stage of his understanding of community. It's out of desperate need, right? Not deliberate choice, as he says. We're talking about self-love. Why does the mother love the child so much? Because the mother is an extension of herself, the child is an extension of the father. What makes the bond so strong, among other things, it's the fact that the child is like you. And what do you like most? You like things that are like you. Self-love starts with the premise that the person we're most concerned with and love the most is ourselves, but by extension, that things that are, we're going to love things that are like us. Imagine those things you come in contact with the first time that you haven't spent a lot of time with, but then you realize they connect to your interest or things that are like you, and you find a natural affinity toward them. So notice the self-interested motivations for caring for the young, for procreating, number one, and then caring for the young. What is the mechanism by which this procedure happens, procreation? He says it's not deliberate choice. So let's flip it on its head. If it's not deliberate choice, what is it? Well, the answer is instinct. This is the Darwinian survival mechanism. This is the genes working through the individual. It's a great book by Richard Dawkins, biologist, scientist. It says it's called The Selfish Gene, such that he describes it, the genes, from such a perspective, in a way that the genes are using your body. What's you? You are just a husk for your genes, so they can, long after you're dead, your genes will still be living off into the future, and that they have used you as a kind of vehicle to perpetuate themselves. So if you think about sex on its most basic level, there's nothing romantic at all about it. It is no different from the replication of a virus, speaking of viruses. So the impulse to sex is obviously, it's not something you choose. It's something that's built into you in order to perpetuate the species. And of course, if you think of Darwin never thinks in terms of individuals of a species. He thinks about the perpetuation of species as communities into the future, right? So notice the language here. He doesn't say man and woman. He talks about male and female, or rather, I should say, female and male. He puts the female first. Gives her the priority. You notice he's speaking about the human animal from a decidedly biological or animal perspective, and discussing a facet of human existence that is exactly identical to every other mammal, right? There's nothing special about what we're doing here. Okay. Then he goes on to talk about slavery. He says, and as a natural ruler, and what is naturally ruled, do for the sake of survival. If something is capable of... And here he speaks of the master and the slave, and he doesn't make it very clear, but we discover that the household consists of a couple and a master and a slave, two communities within the larger community. He says, for as something is capable of rational foresight, it is a natural ruler and master, whereas whatever can use its body to labor is ruled and is a natural slave. That is why the same thing is beneficial for both master and slave. In fact, he is not claiming that the woman is worthy of being a slave. In fact, he makes the very opposite claim, and he says in the next paragraph that there are non-Greeks who see their women, their wives, as slaves, and it is the Greeks precisely who do not see them that way. Now, you have to be very clear here. When he talks about a natural slave and a natural master, he is not talking about a conventional slave and a conventional master. A slave by convention and master by convention is a master or slave by law, as dictated by the conventions of the society, like the antebellum South. Nor is he speaking about anything to do with race. He's speaking about two related things only as the identifying features of master versus slave. One is one's rational foresight, their capacity to utilize their reason, the fundamental tool that human beings have that distinguish them from other animals. The master has rational foresight, and the slave has its body and excellences of the body, right? And by inverse or converse, you could say the slave is lacking that rational foresight. Now notice this definition, because it's natural, implies that with his own, he's not simply reflecting the biases of his society here. It's not accurate. In fact, he's acknowledging that there are people who could be very powerful, considered masters, kings, monarchs, what have you, who are in fact slaves of their own impulses, right? For Aristotle, the full and true meaning of the slave is a person who is an animal in the sense that they are incapable of using their reason properly to guide their life, and instead, or in lieu of their reason, they rely on their impulses. And impulses, as we find out, can lead us in good places, but also not good places. The classic description is one who is a slave to their passions, or a slave to their instincts or impulses. So then we pick up from the bottom of the page, and he says the first thing to emerge from these two communities, that is, the couple and the master and the slave, is the household. So that Hesiod is right when he said in a poem, first and foremost, a house, a wife, an ox for the plow. Now notice what, for Hesiod, a household consists of. It's not just a house. A household is not just the infrastructure, it's what happens there. A house, a wife, so a living and dwelling structure, right? A wife that is, in a sense, the master of the domestic sphere, and is the one tending the children and producing the children, and then an ox for the plow. And then he says this, for an ox is a poor man's servant. Now, I think the actual word here is not servant, but slave. An ox is a poor man's slave. Now, think about what Jefferson said. No man was born with a saddle on his back, nor another with spurs to ride him. An ox, however, seems to be born with a yoke on it, destined to plow the fields for the farmer, and for him to be able to perpetuate his household and provide for its needs. We don't seem to have much problem treating an ox like a slave. In fact, we wouldn't even bother calling the ox a slave, because it seems that word is particularly applied to humans. But in a sense, it is a slave. Aristotle says that a slave is an animate tool. It's a ruthless description, really. An animate tool is simply a living tool. What is a tool? It is an instrument to achieve one's goals. The important thing about the slave as an instrument is that it doesn't achieve its own goals. It achieves the goals of the master. And the will of the master provides the direction for the actions of the slave. And the slave, whether human or whether animal, does not contribute to establishing its own ends of action or behavior. He says the community naturally constituted to satisfy everyday needs, then, is the household. So what is the telos of this community? The telos of this community is to satisfy the needs of everyday needs. Right there. Everyday needs. What's the catch about our needs? They're not one-offs. They happen in time, and they are perpetual. Our bodies are constantly generating them. Food, shelter, warmth, all kinds of resources. He says, in the household, its members are called meal sharers by Charondas and manger sharers by Epimenides the Cretan. But the first community, constituted out of several households for the sake of satisfying needs other than everyday ones, is the village. All right, so let's do this. What is the telos of the village? To satisfy needs other than everyday ones. Well, what are those? I think what he refers to here, everyday needs are ones that are generated every day. Eating, sleeping, protection from the elements. But as a community develops, they realize they're out in the natural world. They're the forces of nature. They're the things we don't have to deal with, right? Well, we've got the coronavirus. So imagine, for example, the coronavirus is a moment that we realize collectively that we're not fully prepared to deal with this kind of threat, because it's not an everyday thing, but it happens only once in a while. So the village seems to get together and start to look down the road using, this is key, rational foresight, looking into the future, planning and anticipating for the future, and able to meet the challenges, which are going to be needs that are going to rise on the horizon. on the horizon. So the needs are related. They're still about survival. They're still about the needs of the body, but it's a temporal distinction here. Let's go back to the household. He says the household members are meal sharers and manger sharers. They eat together and they sleep together. And while he says nothing else about this, he's saying a lot here that he expects his reader to understand. This is an incredibly intimate form of community. Aristotle says in the Ethics that you can't get to know someone unless you've spent time with them. And you can't love them unless you get to know them. So the only way you can truly love or have profound friendship with someone is if you've spent a lot of time with them. The problem is, most people, we simply don't have a tremendous amount of opportunity to spend a lot of time with them. People in our own families we are most intimate with simply for the duration of time we've spent, even if we find them frustrating, right? We have that intimacy because not only are we spending the most time with them, but we're spending time with them in incredibly intimate environments, sleeping and eating together. These are very personal situations. And this is really interesting because Aristotle clearly understands the household is built on biology, right? We're all bound by the same biology, and so will the village be, right? And Aristotle is acknowledging the profound intimacy and solidarity created by the biological relationship of the family, or the family's biological relations and the time spent together. But what's interesting is he's going to say there's something more than just the family that you should have your allegiance to. It is the polis, and that there is a new type of loyalty, a new type of solidarity to be had in the polis and its political life. Okay, so let's move on to the village. He says, as a colony or offshoot from the household, a village seems to be particularly natural. Why? Because it's just a natural, organic extension of the household, consisting of what some have called sharers of the same milk, sons and the sons of sons. That is why city-states were originally ruled by kings, as nations still are. For they were constituted out of people who were under kingships. For in every household the eldest rules as a king, and so the same holds in the offshoots, because the villagers are blood relatives. So what is a village? What is it comprised of? It's comprised of many families that have grown off of the same original family. They are a tribe, they are a clan, and their loyalties exist as an extended family. That's the first important thing. So you notice a couple important things. They are sharers of the same milk. And sons and the sons of sons. What does it mean to be sharers of the same milk? Well, who drinks the same milk? We're talking about the mother's milk. Well, siblings share the same milk. But you might also say that all these people who are here in our village in the present day are descendants from the same ancestor. In a sense, they share the same origin, the same matriarch who first brought the city and the village into existence. Now, I think this statement, sharers of the same milk, can be taken quite literally, but it also can be taken figuratively. What do they share in common? Not just biological relationships, but deep moral and religious relationships that guide their life. And the important thing is that the moral guidance in their life, the laws, as we'll see later in this paragraph, are dictated in the same way that their society is created. It's dictated through generations of tradition, right? Notice they are the sons and the sons of sons. The fact that they are the offspring of ancestors going back, and that they recognize that successive order and the authority of the original parents or the original family that produced them matters. They live in a traditional society in which their codes of conduct, their way of life, is defined by tradition, passed down by tradition, meaning traditio in Latin means to hand down. Tradition is that which is handed down from one generation to the next in continuity, right? So we see This is what Homer is describing when he says, each male in the household lays down the laws for his own wife as children. For they were scattered about, and that is how people dwelt in the distant past. The reason all people say that the gods too are ruled by a king is that they themselves were ruled by kings in the distant past, and some still are. He says, human beings model the shapes of the gods on their own to do the same, and do the same to their way of life as well. Okay, what's the significance of a king? He says it actually comes out of the household. The patriarch of the household is identical to the king ruling over, a village that becomes large enough where they establish someone a king. He is both the top political figure or ruler, but also a father figure, right? And this model of the family is replicated throughout. Just as people descend from one another, their traditions and their moral codes descend. And who is the lawmaker here? It's the father. The father is the one with the authority, not some politician, right? The father is the law. And what we mean by the father is the law, he isn't simply, spelling out some minor moral code, but in fact he's establishing the fundamental rules of the household by which by which the household is going to be run. The important thing is, again, think about the distinction here in Mending Wall between the two characters. Something there is that does not love a wall, right? He's questioning. He wants rational justification for the wall. This is going to be really crucial here as we go forward and conclude. Whereas the other character says he's traditional, right? He's not skeptical. He embraces what is said by his father, good fences make good neighbors. And he's not going to go behind his father's saying, right? He accepts the authority, you could say, of tradition, right? And it's good, and it's right, and it's authoritative because it's old, and because that's the way my ancestor did it. So let's move on to the polis. He says, it is evident from these considerations, then, that a city-state is among the things that exist by nature, that a human being by nature is a political animal, and that anyone who is without a city-state, not by luck, but by nature, luck means chance or accident, not by nature, is either a poor specimen or superhuman. What's a poor specimen? A beast, right? Who's not fit for the polis. Why? Because they don't have speech and reason. They can't participate in the essential aspects of its life. Meanwhile, what's a being that's superhuman? A god. Gods. Why do they not need the polis? Because they're self-sufficient. So lower beings find no place in the polis because they can't contribute, they can't be part of it. And higher beings don't need the polis, right? Like the one Homer condemns, he too is clanless, lawless, and homeless. So what defines human beings and their collective identity? They have clans, they have extended families, they have laws which govern how they act, that form and shape their way of life, and they have homes. And home is not simply a structure where you live, but it's a place where you're rooted to the soil and its identity. For someone with such a nature is at the same time eager for war, like an isolated piece in the chessboard. He seems to think that there are some human beings even that don't fit comfortably within the political structure of the polis, and they create problems. Interesting. It is also clear why a human being is more political than a bee or any other gregarious animal. Nature makes nothing pointlessly, as we say, and no animal has speech except a human being. Okay, so what's going to define our status as a political animal? Ultimately, it's speech and what we do with it in the polis. That's different in the village and the household. But also, it turns out there are other animals that we happen to just be more political than them because of our speech. What is it about a bee that, this is interesting, that Aristotle is inclined to say that it's a political animal? I think the answer is this, and he talks about this in other works. I think the answer is that the life of any individual bee, its meaning and its function is really subordinate to the entire function of the hive, right? Its task, its work in and of itself would really be unintelligible unless you understood how that individual bee is contributing to the well-being of the hive. And it's particularly an animal whose life is subordinate to the social or political order of the whole hive. And therefore the distinction between social and political is not entirely absolute. But the defining thing about a political order for human beings is it's not going to be defined by loyalty to blood. It's going to be a system in which there are many families coming together with different points of view, different ways of life, different traditions, different codes of conduct, different ancestral gods that the city is actually going to have to navigate and try to reconcile in some way to form a harmonious structure. So there's two distinctions with animals. One is speech versus voice, what he calls voice. So we talked about in Sapiens, the monkeys can make fairly primitive, onomatopoetic statements that are very simplistic grammatically, very limited in terms of their vocabulary, number two. And number three, they don't seem to have a whole range of concepts to discuss immaterial things, right? They only seem to be able to discuss things that have a palpable or empirical, tangible existence. So they talk about, as he says, a voice is a signifier of what is pleasant and painful, which is why it is also possessed by other animals. But speech is for making clear what is beneficial and harmful, and hence also what is just or unjust. For it is peculiar to human beings in comparison to the other animals, that they alone have perception of what is good and bad, just and unjust, and the rest. And it is community in these that makes a household or a city-state. That is an important claim. So, obviously, animals responding in a stimuli response to environment feel pleasure and feel pain. They seek out the pleasure. They try to avoid the pain. And Aristotle says, perhaps a little bit simplistically, that they make vocalizations in response to those feelings, those immediate feelings of pleasure and pain, which are all instinctual. Human speech, logos, is capable of discussing moral concepts that have no tangible existence, precisely because they don't perfectly align with the tangible realities or empirical realities of pleasure and pain. Right? Many things that are good for you are painful, and many things that are pleasurable are not, or many things that are bad for you happen to be very pleasurable, as some of you may know. Okay, so it's the power of language to speak about, you could say, imagined concepts, a creative function of language, or simply to see things, to perceive. It uses the word perceive things, that are seen not with the eyes, but with the mind's eye through speech. And it is community in these, in what? In codes of moral conduct, in conceptions of right and wrong. That is the common denominator. A community is held together by things it holds in common. What is it? Community in community of good and bad, right and wrong, as manifest through the laws. Okay. So let's think about it for a second here. He says that a citizen is one who is of the polis. And a citizen, interestingly enough, the man in the household, tending the household, is not engaging in his status as a citizen. He says in Book 3, a citizen is one who participates in rule. They rule and are ruled in turn. Right? They participate in their own self-governance. They don't simply live and pay taxes and vote when they feel like it, and so on and so forth. And he says more specifically, what a citizen is not just one who rules, but when they rule, they deliberate. They deliberate. So think about all these citizens from different villages. And in ancient Athens, the city was actually divided up in districts based on family clan villages. So when people actually came to the assembly, they were actually seeing people from other clans in that public environment that they wouldn't typically be around in their private environment, and they had to confront different points of view, right? So deliberation becomes the central use of reason in the polis to decide about what is right and wrong, what is good and bad, what is beneficial and harmful, for the sake of the whole community. And of course the problem is, coming from these different villages, these different factions, they all have different opinions. So what are they going to have to... They are forced not to just deliberate internally, but to deliberate amongst themselves, precisely because they have different opinions about what constitutes the well-being or the common interest of the society, right? And they're going to have to deliberate, they're going to have to dispute with one another, they're going to have to exchange ideas, kind of the assembly and free speech, and they're going to have to reach resolution. They're going to have to be resolved to either not pass law at all, or make some law that they can all sufficiently agree to through their public reasoning. Now think about this. Aristotle is openly acknowledging here, in the ancient world, this is quite stunning, that law does not come from the gods. It's not handed down to Moses on Mount Sinai. It's made by human beings. In that traditional world, prior to the polis, this would be a radical claim, because the laws as understood in a village would have said to have descended from their ancestral gods. Their ancestors would have been seen as gods after they died, and that therefore that the laws were divine in origin. Aristotle is saying, no, the basis for law is not God, it's us. And here's the key thing, what determines a good law is not its ancestry and its antiquity, right? But rather, is it reasonable? Because we're going to use our reason collectively to dispute and determine the validity of the law. If we don't like it, based on our reason, we don't pass it. So we're not going to say, just because my father did it, it is good. We're going to say, because it's gone through the scrutiny of rational public analysis, that we've deemed that it's a good law. So let's skip over to here. He says, anyone who cannot form a community with others, or who does not need to because he is self-sufficient, is no part of the city-state, beasts or gods. He is either a beast or God. Hence, though an impulse toward this sort of community exists by nature in everyone, whoever first established one was responsible for the greatest of goods. So he says the polis is by nature, it's natural, but that doesn't necessarily mean it always comes into existence. He's acknowledging that there may have been some wise, heroic, you might even say genius, who managed to devise such a way of living. Of course, a lot of these things come to existence through kind of happenstance and accident. He says, for as a human being is best of the animals when perfected, so when separated from law and justice, he is the worst. Now this really gets at it. The goal of the polis is to perfect the human being, to complete the human being, to realize all their implicit faculties as a human being. When separated from law and justice, we're the worst animals of all. We're much worse than the other animals, and we'll see why in a moment. But therefore, when we are not separated from law, well, what is the thing that perfects us? It's law. It's law. Law doesn't simply dictate right or wrong. It shapes our actions and shapes our minds and souls into good citizens. And if the laws are good, they're going to be designed to facilitate our own excellence, right? You think, at least on paper, that is the goal of laws, to bring out the best in humanity. Aristotle says, Plato in his book called The Laws say, the laws are the true educators of men. They don't just tell us what to do, but they shape our actions in a way that they shape our identities. They make us into good citizens. And this is interesting, because if we think of happiness or the good life, we would think probably being a good citizen and following the law is hardly a comprehensive understanding of the satisfactions we take that we would call happiness in our lives. And that, we're going to see, is found in the ethics. He says, for injustice is harsh when it has weapons, and a human being grows up with weapons for virtue and practical wisdom to use, which are particularly open to being used for the opposite purposes. Hence he is the most unrestrained and most savage of animals when he lacks virtue, as well as the worst where food and sex are concerned. We have weapons for virtue and practical wisdom turns out to be a virtue of the soul and something central to living the good life. What is this weapon? It's a tool. What is the tool human beings have at their disposal to live well or poorly? It is reason, right? Reason can make us angelic, and reason can also make us diabolical. And it's precisely, the animals lack reason, and it's precisely why they're neither angelic nor diabolical, right? Lastly, but justice is a political matter. Oh, here we go. But justice is a political matter, for justice is the organization of the political community, and justice decides what justice. So there's this odd redundancy of justice decides what does. You would think it's not justice that decides what's just. It's people. It's the people who rule. Justice is a matter of bringing law and order to the society in the interests of the community. What did we say? Justice are the rules that facilitate the interest of the community. Therefore, it's by definition a political matter. Notice we're dealing with all these public matters connected with human happiness of the community and not with private matters. The private matters will emerge in the ethics. For justice is the organization of the political community. Well, what is the organization of the political community? That is the politeia. That is the constitution. That is the structure. And what is the structure of the political community defined by? It's defined by who rules primarily. And they provide the structure, and they shape the laws in their own image. Right? The politeuma is the ruling class. And it's the ruling class that decides what's just. So if we turn to this chart and move forward here, we see that the origin of all the communities are the needs of survival. The telos of the couple is procreation, of the household its everyday needs, the village its longer-term needs, and the polis its human happiness. Now, what is the role of reason in the couple? It's none, because it's done on instinct. He says deliberate choice is not involved. The household, we use reason and calculation to figure out how to get our needs, right? What's called instrumental reason, right? The needs are dictated, there are our ends, there are our goals, and they're dictated by our bodies, right? We use our reason to figure out how to best get those things, right? Reason does not determine what you want. It just determines how you might best go about getting it. In the village, we start using reason in a more foresighted way, looking into the more distant future to kind of anticipate and plan for those things. But in many ways, it's the same way of the household. In the polis, however, we don't just look into the future, but we use rational public deliberation to determine our way in life, a way of life, and our laws that up until this time has been dictated by tradition and largely fixed. So lastly, what does it mean to live in a polis and to be a political animal? We're a political animal because we live in a polis, and it has all this infrastructure that we've talked about. Education, economics, political life. We're political because we have speech rather than just voice, and speech allows us to speak of intangible concepts of good and bad, good and evil, and to deliberate collectively about how we want to live, and to base those deliberations based on public reasoning. Deliberation is necessary because we are not naturally of one mind about how we should live, because we're all individuals, we have distinct opinions. How we want to live is based on an opinion of what we believe is happiness is. This opinion will be manifest in the laws and will shape and habituate our actions and our thoughts and opinions as well. The laws educate us and make us into citizens and patriots. Thus, the city's primary, but not only concern, is justice, the establishment of what is just and the meting out of rewards and punishments based on the conduct of its citizens. And what's the point of the whole code of justice? To help to provide the circumstances, not just of life, but of the good life.